The thing about Glacier 7 was that it had looked so stable in the orbital surveys. Beautiful even in that hostile sort of way that made xenobiologists go misty-eyed about pristine ecosystems and untouched research opportunities. The ice shelf stretched for kilometers, a vast crystalline platform that had existed undisturbed for approximately 12,000 local years. The multi-species expedition had set up their primary base camp right on top of it, because the panoramic views were spectacular and the ice core samples were conveniently accessible. Then, at approximately 0300 hours local time, 12,000 years of geological stability decided it had an appointment elsewhere. The sound was apocalyptic. Not the quick crack of breaking glass, but a deep, resonating groan that seemed to come from the planet's core itself, as if Glacier 7 had finally gotten tired of hosting tourists and decided to file a noise complaint with the universe. The ice shelf didn't just break, it shattered, fragmented, and reorganized itself into a chaotic landscape of jagged towers and yawning crevasses, all while the expedition members were still inside their heated habitat modules. Commander Zelvin of the Valkyrie, a crystalline being whose species had evolved in the comfortable radiation fields of a binary star system, watched his entire command center slide sideways into a newly formed chasm. His thought matrix, which normally operated at frequencies that could calculate hyperspace trajectories in milliseconds, suddenly reduced itself to a single repeating message. Well, this is suboptimal. The habitat modules crumpled like discarded food wrappers, power cells sparked and died. The communications array, which had cost more than some planets' GDP, took a scenic tumble into a crevasse that had definitely not been there during dinner. Within 90 seconds, the expedition's carefully planned research station had been reduced to scattered debris across a fractured ice field, and the temperature was a brisk -43 degrees. The survivors, and calling them that felt optimistic, gathered in small clusters near the wreckage. The Valkyrie tried desperately to amplify their internal frequencies enough to punch a distress signal through the ionosphere. The Thornback delegation, insectoid beings from a high-gravity world, attempted to burrow into the ice using their natural excavation abilities, only to discover that frozen water at -43 degrees had structural properties similar to reinforced concrete. The Kixian, whose aquatic ancestors had never encountered anything colder than a pleasant temperate current, simply locked up. Their respiratory systems, designed for processing dissolved oxygen from liquid water, began making alarming whistling sounds as moisture froze in their gill slits. One of them managed to vocalize something that translated roughly as "I appear to be crystallizing from the inside out," which did wonders for group morale. Zelvin ran the calculations. At current temperature, with no shelter, inadequate thermal clothing, and zero chance of rescue arriving within the next 8 hours, well, the mathematics were unkind. They had perhaps 3 hours before the cold killed the warm-blooded species. Maybe 5 before even the Valkyrie's crystalline matrices became too brittle to maintain consciousness. This wasn't a survival situation. This was a mass casualty event waiting to happen, and they were all just conscious enough to watch it unfold. Then he noticed the humans doing something strange. There were 5 humans in the expedition, backup engineers mostly, since humans had a reputation for fixing things with improvised solutions that made proper engineers develop stress-induced molting. Zelvin had always found them slightly unsettling, with their bilateral symmetry and those mobile external lenses they called eyes. But right now, they were being unsettling in a completely different way. They weren't panicking, they weren't even standing still. One of them, a female with dark skin and her head covering blown off in the disaster, exposing the keratinous filaments humans called hair, was moving through the wreckage with purpose. She was collecting things: metal panels, insulation foam, cargo netting. She was building a pile, sorting materials like someone doing inventory rather than someone facing imminent death. Another human, this one male with facial hair that seemed excessive even by human standards, had produced something from his clothing. A small folding tool, no larger than his palm, that somehow contained 12 different implements. He was using it to dismantle part of a broken equipment crate, removing bolts with mechanical precision, his breath forming clouds in the frozen air. "What," Zelvin transmitted on the general frequency, "are they doing?" A thornback named Crix, whose compound eyes could process visual information across a spectrum Zelvin couldn't even perceive, tilted his head. "I believe they are organizing." "Organizing what?" "Our remains?" "Uncertain. But they appear to have a plan." The humans did indeed appear to have a plan. The female was calling out instructions in that efficient, clipped tone that humans used when they were being serious. "Marcus, I need structural supports. Anything load-bearing. Chen, start gathering all the thermal insulation you can find. Ravi, check what's left of the supply modules. We need any intact emergency rations. Jackson, I need you on water collection detail." Water collection. Crix's translator struggled with the concept. There is no liquid water within 300 kilometers. One of the humans, Jackson, apparently turned toward them. He was holding a large container and had what humans called a grin on his face, which Zelvin had learned meant either friendliness or imminent danger, and context was essential for determining which. "Snow, buddy. Snow is just water that's having a phase crisis. We'll work it out." Then Jackson started scooping snow into his container, like this was a reasonable response to an extinction-level event. The female, her name tag identified her as Rodriguez, had stopped collecting materials and was now examining the debris field with her mobile eyes. She was holding something flat in her hand, a circular device with a needle. "Winds coming from the northeast. We'll need the shelters positioned to break it. Marcus, we're building there, and there." She pointed to 3 locations that looked exactly like every other location to Zelvin's perception, but apparently meant something to human survival instincts. "Building what?" Zelvin managed to transmit. Rodriguez looked at him with an expression that suggested she'd forgotten other species were present. "Shelters. We can't survive exposure, and rescue won't arrive for at least 6 to 8 hours based on our last known transmission window, so we build." "Build from what?" "Everything is destroyed. Everything is materials," Rodriguez corrected. "Just disorganized." And then, while several species processed the philosophical implications of that statement, the humans began to build. It was the most absurd thing Zelvin had ever witnessed, and he'd once observed a Kixian opera. Marcus and Rodriguez took the largest pieces of debris, hull panels from the destroyed modules, and began wedging them into the ice, creating angular walls. They used the metal supports as frames, jamming them into cracks in the ice shelf with a brutality that suggested they expected the materials to simply obey through intimidation. Chen was layering thermal insulation foam between panels, creating walls that were part salvage, part improvisation, and entirely defiant of proper engineering protocols. "This is insane," transmitted one of the Thornbacks. "That structure cannot possibly be stable." Marcus, overhearing through his translator, didn't even look up. "Doesn't need to be stable for 10 years. Needs to be stable for 6 hours. Different engineering problem." The humans worked with an efficiency that bordered on disturbing. They knew exactly what they were doing, moving through the construction process with the casual competence of individuals who had done this before. multiple times. Perhaps as a recreational activity, which was a thought that made Zelvin's crystalline matrix shudder. Rodriguez was directing the construction of 3 separate structures, 1 large shelter and 2 smaller ones. The Kixian need higher humidity, she called out. Seal that shelter tighter. The thornbacks can handle lower temperatures but need more space for their body structure. Adjust accordingly. She was building species-specific emergency housing in an apocalypse, on a frozen planet. Using garbage, Chen had started singing something while he worked, a rhythmic vocalization that other humans apparently recognized because Jackson joined in. It was called, Zelvin's translator informed him, a working song, and it seemed to serve no survival function whatsoever, except possibly psychological warfare against the concept of death itself. We're all gonna freeze, but not today. Not today. Jackson sang cheerfully while packing snow around the base of a shelter for insulation. We're all gonna die, but first we'll try. We'll try. The lyrics were objectively terrible. The melody was somehow worse. Zelvin found himself unable to look away. Within 40 minutes, the humans had constructed 3 shelters from wreckage and ice. They weren't pretty. They looked like something designed by a committee of mad engineers working during a psychotic break, but they existed, which was more than could be said for the previous habitats. The humans began herding the other species inside, arranging them in the shelters with specific positioning. Valkyrie in the center, you generate ambient heat through your metabolic processes. Kixian on the inside perimeter, where humidity will be highest. Thornbacks, you're good with cold, but let's not test it. Inside. Now. The thornbacks hesitated. Their cultural protocols required consensus decisions made through proper hierarchical channels. One of them began to vocalize the formal request for a leadership conference. Rodriguez interrupted. Great idea. You can hold your meeting inside where you won't die. Move. They moved. The shelters were cramped, uncomfortable, and smelled like burned insulation and terror, but they were warmer than outside. Not warm, still cold enough that Zelvin could see his own crystalline structure beginning to contract, but survivably cold rather than lethally cold. The humans had bought them time, pulled from absolutely nothing using materials that had been, minutes ago, disaster wreckage. But the humans weren't done. Ravi had gathered pieces of broken power cells and was doing something inadvisable with their remaining charge. He'd arranged debris in a pile, broken panels, insulation, fragments of equipment that would never function again, and was using a power cell's discharge to ignite it. Fire bloomed in the shelter entrance. Actual combustion, that primitive chemical reaction that most species had abandoned when they discovered cleaner energy sources. The flames were orange and yellow and completely mesmerizing, throwing dancing shadows across the ice walls. "Is that safe?" transmitted a Valkyrie named Quinth, whose thought matrix was apparently still capable of worrying about protocols. "Safer than freezing," Marcus replied, feeding more material into the flames. "And we've got ventilation. See that gap Rodriguez left in the roof design? That's not sloppy engineering. That's a chimney." The heat was immediate and glorious. The flames consumed the debris and converted it into warmth, the temperature in the shelter climbing from lethal to merely dangerous. Jackson had positioned his snow-filled containers near the fire, and the snow was melting, transforming into liquid water that he was collecting in salvaged bottles. "Hydration protocol," he announced, offering a bottle to the nearest thornback. "You need to drink. Cold air is dry. You're losing moisture with every breath." The thornback accepted the water with mandibles that were still trembling from cold. "You learned this where?" "Summer camp. I was 8. Your species teaches survival skills to juveniles. Well, yeah. How else would they learn? The Thornback had no response to that, possibly because his entire worldview was being restructured around the revelation that human children were trained in apocalypse management. Chen was doing something with the remaining emergency rations, crushing them in his hands and mixing them with melted snow in a salvaged container. He'd positioned it near the fire, and the mixture was beginning to heat, producing steam that smelled like synthesized proteins and desperation. Zelvin watched through the shelter entrance, his crystalline structure slowly warming back to operational temperatures. The humans had created shelter, fire, water, and now they were cooking. They were cooking in a survival situation. The sheer audacity of it triggered something in his thought matrix that might have been the Valkyrie equivalent of hysterical laughter. The night passed in a blur of cold fear and the steady presence of humans who refused to acknowledge that they were supposed to be dead. Rodriguez maintained a rotation schedule, ensuring someone was always awake to feed the fire. Marcus checked on each species, regularly, monitoring for signs of hypothermia or system failure. Chen kept producing warm water, forcing everyone to drink at regular intervals like a very aggressive host at a terrible party. The dawn on Glacier 7 was spectacular in the way that things you never expected to see again tend to be. The light crept across the fractured ice field, illuminating the disaster zone and the improbable shelters that had somehow kept 27 beings alive through the night. And that's when the humans started cooking breakfast. Chen had been working for the past hour with Rodriguez, combining emergency rations with melted snow, adding something from sealed packages labeled seasoning and bouillon cubes, whatever those were. The mixture simmered in a salvaged container, producing steam and an aroma that made Zelvin's sensory processors activate pathways he didn't know he had. "Soup's ready," Chen announced, like this was a normal statement to make. "Come get it while it's hot." Soup. They had made soup on a frozen death world, using garbage and snow and the sheer stubbornness that apparently characterized human survival instincts. They had made soup. Rodriguez was ladling it into improvised bowls, pieces of hull plating that had been cleaned and shaped into containers. She was checking something on a datapad that had somehow survived the disaster. "Valkyrie, get the silicone supplemented version. Your metabolic processes need the mineral content. Thornbacks, you're getting the high-protein variant. Kixian, I've diluted yours and added the trace elements from your dietary requirements file." She had made species-specific soup variations in an apocalypse, based on nutritional requirements. Zelvin accepted his portion, which was warm against his crystalline manipulators. The liquid was brown, steaming, and smelled like something that wanted him to continue existing. He consumed a measure, and his thought matrix processed flavors that registered as acceptable, nourishing, and inexplicably comforting. "This is adequate," he transmitted, which was the highest compliment Valkyrie culture had for food. Rodriguez grinned. "Yeah, well, I've made better. But considering we're cooking with debris and melted disaster, I'll take adequate." The other survivors consumed their portions in various states of disbelief. The Thornbacks made clicking sounds that indicated satisfaction. One of the Kixian, whose gill slits had finally stopped making concerning noises, transmitted something that translated as "I do not understand what is happening, but I wish to continue experiencing it." Jackson was already preparing a second batch, melting more snow with the casual efficiency of someone who had done this dozens of times. "Anyone wants seconds? We've got enough rations to keep everyone fed until rescue arrives." "How did you know to prepare soup?" asked Crix, His compound eyes focused on the human with an intensity that suggested he was filing this information away for future reference, possibly in a report titled "Species that should never be allowed to experience actual hardship because they will make everyone else feel inadequate." Jackson shrugged, a peculiar human gesture that involved moving the shoulder joints. Hot food, warm liquids, basic survival stuff. Keeps morale up, keeps your core temperature stable, and honestly, people just feel better when someone's feeding them. It's hospitality. "We are in a survival situation," Zelvin transmitted, "not a social gathering." "Same thing for humans," Rodriguez said. She was cleaning the cooking equipment now, maintaining order even in chaos. "Taking care of people is how we survive, always has been." The rescue ships arrived at approximately 0900 hours, their scanners locating the expedition's emergency beacons. The rescue commander, a Velkari named Tresh, who had seen dozens of disaster sites, prepared himself for the grim task of body recovery and survivor triage. His ship descended toward the coordinates, sensors painting a picture of catastrophic structural failure and environmental exposure. What the sensors hadn't prepared him for was the organized encampment. There were shelters, actual engineered structures built from wreckage. There was smoke rising from a controlled fire. And there were survivors standing outside, wrapped in improvised thermal blankets made from insulation foam and cargo netting, drinking something from containers while conversing calmly. Tresh's thought matrix experienced something that might have been confusion or possibly a minor system error. "Rescue Team Alpha to expedition survivors. We have arrived for emergency evacuation. What is your status?" Rodriguez's voice came back over the communication channel, calm and steady. "Morning, rescue team. Status is stable. All expedition members alive and accounted for. We have 3 shelters operational, adequate water supply, and hot food available. We can begin orderly evacuation whenever you're ready. Also, we've got soup if your team is hungry. Made extra." There was a long pause while Tresh's thought matrix processed this information and failed to reconcile it with any known disaster response protocol. "You have soup?" "Yes, sir. It's not gourmet, but it's hot. And it's edible. Want some?" The rescue team landed and began processing the survivors, running medical scans and confirming vital signs. Every species was alive. Some were cold. Most were shaken, but all were stable. The medical officer kept rechecking her instruments, convinced they were malfunctioning because the readings indicated that people who should have died from exposure were instead showing signs of adequate hydration and recent caloric intake. Tresh examined the shelters with growing disbelief. They were structurally sound, not to regulation standards but functional. They showed signs of deliberate design, adapted for multiple species requirements. Someone had engineered these with knowledge of cross-species environmental needs. "The humans built these," Zelvin transmitted, anticipating the question. "All 3 shelters, also the fire, the water supply, and the soup." The soup was unexpected for all of us. One of the Thornbacks approached Tresh, still wrapped in a human-made insulation blanket. "Commander, I must file a formal report about human survival capabilities. We were given to understand that humans were engineers and technicians. We were not informed that they possess extinction resistance protocols embedded in their cultural baseline." Tresh watched as Marcus demonstrated to one of the rescue technicians how he'd constructed the shelter frame using leverage and improvised tools. The human was explaining basic camping principles and stuff you learn in Scouts, references that meant nothing to Tresh, but apparently constituted fundamental human education. "How long did construction take?" Tresh asked. "About an hour for the first shelter," Rodriguez said. She was helping pack up the equipment now, maintaining the same organizational efficiency she'd shown during the disaster. We had to adapt for different species' needs, so the other two took a bit longer. Maybe 90 minutes total. You built emergency housing for multiple species in 90 minutes using disaster debris. Well, yeah, what else were we going to do? Freeze. It was the casual nature of it that made Tresh's thought matrix stall. The humans weren't boasting. They weren't treating this as remarkable. They had simply identified a problem, imminent death by exposure, and solved it using available materials and apparently instinctive knowledge, the same way Tresh might calculate a hyperspace trajectory. Survival wasn't a skill they'd learned. It was something they simply knew, embedded so deep in their cultural matrix that they taught it to juveniles for recreational purposes. The rescue team completed the evacuation over the next 2 hours. The expedition members were loaded onto the ships, given proper medical care and thermal regulation, and began the journey back to the orbital station. The humans were the last to board, making sure everyone else was secure first, because of course they were. As the ship lifted off, Tresh looked down at the disaster site. The shelters remained, strange monuments to human stubbornness built from garbage and determination. The fire was still burning, a small defiant flame against the frozen landscape. "Commander," one of his crew transmitted, "I don't understand. The humans had no specialized equipment, no survival gear. How did they know how to do all of that?" Tresh thought about the soup, the species-specific nutritional considerations, the shelters with ventilation systems that doubled as chimneys, the casual competence with which humans had converted disaster into uncomfortable but survivable circumstances. "I believe," he transmitted slowly, "that we have been fundamentally misunderstanding something about human evolutionary history." Back at the orbital station, the incident report began circulating through official channels, then unofficial ones, then across the broader galactic community, with the speed that only truly bizarre stories could achieve. Other species read about the disaster with professional interest, then growing fascination, then something approaching existential concern. Humans, it turned out, came from a world where survival situations were common enough that they'd developed entire cultural frameworks around them. They had activities called camping, where they voluntarily simulated equipment failure in hostile environments. For fun, they taught juveniles how to build emergency shelters and start fires and purify water, the same way other species taught mathematics and proper social protocols. A Velkari xenoanthropologist named Quell published a paper titled "Perpetual Emergency Response: Human Cultural Adaptation to Environmental Hostility." It detailed how humans had evolved on a planet that was, by most species standards, actively trying to kill them with weather patterns that varied wildly, tectonic activity that rearranged landscapes without warning, and atmospheric conditions that could shift from survivable to lethal within hours. They'd developed persistence not as a philosophical concept, but as a baseline survival requirement. The Kixian diplomatic corps quietly updated their human liaison protocols to include appreciation for environmental adaptation expertise. The Thornback Engineering Guild issued a formal request for human consultants to review their emergency response training, particularly the modules on improvised construction under adverse conditions. And somehow, through channels that nobody could quite track, human emergency response specialists started appearing on multi-species expeditions with increasing frequency. Not as leaders, humans were terrible at formal hierarchical structures, but as advisors who would politely suggest things like, "Maybe we should pack extra thermal supplies," and "What's the emergency shelter plan?" and "Has anyone thought about water procurement if the primary systems fail?" They were questions that before Glacier 7, most species had considered paranoid. After Glacier 7, they were considered prudent. Rodriguez returned to her regular duties as an engineer, fixing ships and designing systems with the same competence she'd shown building shelters from disaster debris. She updated the expedition safety manual to include an appendix titled Emergency Protocols for Environmental Survival, which covered topics like shelter construction, fire starting, water purification, and because someone had to say it, soup recipes adjusted for mixed species nutritional requirements. The manual was officially adopted by 17 different space agencies within a month. Marcus started teaching a course called Primitive Survival Skills for Modern Engineers, which was supposed to be a joke until 300 people registered for it, and he realized he actually had to develop a curriculum. The course covered topics like how to build anything from 3 pieces of wire and pure spite, and advanced applications of the multi-tool philosophy. It became the highest-rated elective in the engineering program. Chen received a commendation for exceptional resourcefulness under adverse conditions, which he accepted gracefully, and then immediately asked if anyone wanted to see his collection of camping equipment, because apparently he carried enough survival gear in his personal locker to sustain a small colony through an apocalypse. Nobody was surprised. The broader galactic community developed a running joke about humans and their camping gear, which became shorthand for the peculiar human habit of preparing for disasters that probably wouldn't happen but might, and if they did, wouldn't it be embarrassing to die because you didn't pack a fire starter and a multi-tool? Ships with human crew members started carrying what other species considered excessive emergency supplies, things like manual fire-starting equipment, physical water filtration devices, and enough preserved food to survive extended equipment failures. Human engineers would shrug and say things like better to have it and not need it, and you never know, which were apparently human proverbs about the fundamental uncertainty of the universe and the importance of being prepared to punch entropy in the face with organized debris. But the real shift happened quietly, in the way that cultural changes always do. Species that had never considered environmental hostility as anything more than a sensor reading began to look at their emergency protocols with more scrutiny. They started asking questions like, what if the primary habitat fails, and how would we survive without technology, and should we perhaps learn some of these primitive skills the humans find so fundamental? The answers were usually uncomfortable, which was precisely the point. Zelvin, who had watched his entire command structure slide into a crevasse, and then watched 5 humans rebuild civilization from the wreckage, wrote his own report. It was shorter than the official incident documentation, just a single paragraph transmitted to the Velkari collective archives. Humans do not treat survival as an exceptional circumstance requiring specialized response. They treat it as a baseline condition requiring constant attention. This is because their homeworld apparently spent several million years trying to kill them, and they evolved to find this arrangement acceptable and possibly character-building. They pack fire-starting equipment on spaceships. They teach children to build emergency shelters. They respond to disasters by organizing debris and making soup. We have been traveling among the stars while forgetting that stars are hostile environments, and humans have never forgotten this. Perhaps we should pay attention to the species that still remembers how to build something from nothing, just in case everything becomes nothing and we need to start over. Also, their soup is surprisingly adequate. The report was filed, catalogued, and became one of the most accessed documents in the Velkari archives, which said something about how thoroughly Glacier 7 had unsettled the broader understanding of human capabilities. On Earth, nobody really noticed the galactic attention. Humans were busy doing human things, building cities, designing ships, teaching children how to start campfires and pitch tents, and survive in the woods for a weekend, because that was what summer vacation was for. They packed camping gear in their personal lockers when they shipped out to space stations, because you never knew when you might need it. And somewhere, on a frozen planet called Glaciers 7, 3 shelters built from disaster debris still stood on a fractured ice shelf, strange monuments to the species that looked at apocalypse and thought, yes, but have you considered soup? The ice had broken their camp. The humans had built shelters, melted snow, and served breakfast at dawn. And the galaxy, having witnessed this casual defiance of entropy, had collectively decided that maybe, just maybe, the species that still remembered how to make fire should probably be invited to more planning committees. Because you never knew when you might need someone who considered building civilization from garbage a recreational activity suitable for 8-year-olds. The universe was hostile, it always had been. But humans had looked at that hostility and decided that the appropriate response was organization, soup, and the stubborn insistence that today was not the day for dying. And honestly, most of the galaxy was starting to think that was a pretty reasonable philosophy.